The moment the iron door swung shut, the air in the hold thickened as if the tide had been cut off mid-surge. The ship kept roaring through the night, the steel plates and rivets sending up a steady, low vibration that travelled into bone and teeth. A bare bulb swung inside its wire cage, washing the cramped space in a sickly, pallid light and picking out faces scraped raw by salt wind and long transport. Skin cracked, lips split, eyes ringed in grey fatigue. Heinrich Walter was shoved forward by the press of bodies, his shoulder blades driven into a stranger's chest. Behind him, the push came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Ahead, the corridor narrowed into deeper dark. Someone retched in a corner. Cold damp rose through the seams of the rough planking and clung to trouser cuffs. Heinrich had spent years with his ears full of the hiss and chatter of naval radio, but he had never felt so replaceable as he did inside this sealed, echoing chamber. Outside the door, footsteps receded down the passageway. A latch dropped. Metal struck metal, and the ring of it jumped along the ceiling beams and back again, as if the hold itself were repeating the sound to make it undeniable. In the center of the door, a sheet of paper was taped down hard, its corners flattened with the care of a technical drawing. It was laid out in clean boxes and time blocks, short lines arranged one beneath another. Beside them were little squares, spaces meant for checkmarks and verification. The paper did not speak of punishment. It did not threaten. It reduced the captivity to a sequence: roll call, ventilation, water, latrine rotation, medical inspection, safety drills. At the bottom, set apart as if it mattered more than the rest, one line insisted on an emergency order of movement and the final requirement before the door was closed again. Head count verified. Even in the damp, the paper kept its stiffness. It looked like a declaration that on this ship, even confusion would be measured. Heinrich glanced at it and let the corner of his mouth lift into something thin and hard. In the last days in Tunisia, he had seen papers like this everywhere. Duty rosters clipped beside the radio table, logs for codebook changes, antenna inspection lists. Then, the forms had been backed by orders and gunfire. Now the form was backed by an enemy. The symmetry struck him as something he could use, as a small advantage. If the captors needed their procedures, then their power was less primal than rumor claimed. He swallowed his fear and allowed the sneer to appear first, as if contempt could step between him and panic. Seeing through people, seeing through systems, had become his charm against helplessness. It gave him the illusion of stepping out of the prisoner's skin. The end of the Tunisian campaign had not been grand. It had been thin and quiet, the radio calls on the net growing sparse, the ammunition crates emptying, supply trucks failing to arrive. Heinrich had stuffed the last roll of cipher tape into his pocket out of habit, still aligning numbers in his head the way his training demanded, still trying to make the world add up when the world no longer cared for sums. After that came assembly points, registration, numbering, and the long bureaucratic funnel that turned men into entries on lists. Allied trucks carried them off dusty roads toward the coast. One inventory sheet after another flipped over under someone else's thumb. Signatures and stamps came down like weights, compressing each life into an archive. Now, in the hold, he caught the occasional sharp signal from above deck, short whistles, the scrape of rope against metal, and recognized the rhythms of a convoy. The ship was part of an escorted formation, its portholes sealed under blackout discipline. Their speed, their course, the hours of movement, and the hours of waiting were not theirs to decide. The Atlantic was a distance to be crossed inside rules and steel. The hold itself was not wide. A cargo compartment had been turned into a prison space, leaving low passageways between steel beams and pipes. Rough wooden planks covered the deck, and moisture breathed up through the cracks. The prisoners were distributed into sections that could be counted and controlled. Bunks were wedged so tight there was hardly room to roll over without knocking a knee into someone else. The air carried sweat, engine oil, and the sourness of long-closed damp. Transatlantic transport rules took everything and broke it into manageable units. Each man was one digit in a set. Each swallow of water, each breath of fresh air, each trip to relieve himself had to happen inside a timed window, or the next procedure would be squeezed and the whole schedule would buckle. Through the bulkheads, the engines kept striking a steady pulse, hammering the reminder that this was not a temporary pen. It was a planned long-distance movement built to carry them across an ocean and deliver them intact to another system. Before long, the small inspection window in the door snapped open and a brighter beam fell across the planking. Escort guards began roll call and verification in the order laid out on the sheet. Names were called. Responses were recorded, numbers were recalculated. Only after several checks did a pen draw its line and a hand mark the box on the form. Some men deliberately delayed. Some acted as if they had not heard. Some tried to shoulder into the passageway to force confusion. The guards did not speed up, and they did not stall. The notebook in their hands behaved like a fixed gauge. Every interruption had to come back to the same line. Heinrich listened to the cadence of English as if it were being typed out in code, clean and percussive. It was not the venting of temper. It was a record made for someone higher up to read, a record that would hold the guard responsible if it did not match reality. Ventilation followed roll call without pause as the paper promised. The door was cracked open to a narrow gap at the scheduled time, and cold air flowed in like water poured into a pot, thinning the heat that had already started to build in the hold. The crowd surged toward the opening by instinct and need, but the guards pressed them back with hand signals and body position until the passage remained usable. The corridor had to stay clear, or the next rotation would jam and the entire schedule would fail. A medic entered behind them, a bag slung at his side. He checked the seal on the water buckets and the cleanliness of the ladle. His gaze moved over faces, lips, fingernails, small practical indicators that recorded fever, cough, and broken skin. He did not choose favorites. He did not treat inspection as humiliation. His movements were quick, spare, and competent, like a job that could not be skipped simply because the subjects were prisoners. Distribution followed the same discipline. Bread was cut into equal portions. Cans were divided among groups. The bucket stopped at fixed points. When it was a man's turn, he held out a cup. The rim was required to keep clear of the ladle handle. Someone tried to take more than his share and was stopped. A finger pointed at a blank square in the record book, a silent demand that the rotation be completed in order before anything else was argued. Full buckets and empty buckets were both counted. Dirty containers were carried away and exchanged. For a brief time, the sharp, clean smell of disinfectant overcame the mold. In these details, the procedure revealed another boundary. The guards were bound by the paper as well. They had to finish the distribution on time, make the numbers match, and hand in their signatures. If they failed, responsibility did not vanish into the air. It traveled up a chain that could return and land on them. Heinrich stayed in shadow and deliberately did not move toward the door. He knew enough English to turn the checklist into German for the men around him, yet he pressed his tongue against his teeth. He made himself into a silent strip of coded tape, refusing to become an interpreter for his fellow prisoners. To him, explanation would be a kind of surrender. If he translated the rules, he would be admitting that the enemy's system did not only control bodies, it claimed the story of what was happening. He preferred to let people call their unease a conspiracy. That way, at least, he could package his own fear as judgment. But the checklist did not fail just because he despised it. The second roll call came on time. The third ventilation did not lag. Water and latrine access were released in batches. The line was divided and reformed. The head count was verified again and again. Each verification felt like a nail driven through agitation into the wooden deck. Men like Schmidt used the gaps between procedures to murmur about sinking and disposal, to turn fear into a tool for obedience. A young prisoner named Klaus had gone pale. His fingers clenched the edge of a bunk as if he might be lifted and thrown by an inner wave at any moment. Heinrich heard the whispering and could not find a more forceful rebuttal because he refused to provide the only information source that could be checked. That night, a deeper roll in the ship made the entire hold sway. Bunk frames creaked. Several men grabbed at the same pipe at once. Heinrich's hand rose on instinct and met the pipe's cold metal. In that instant, he remembered the feel of his fingertips pressing a key in the radio room, the way an instruction passed from one point to another and became a chain that could be verified. Now the chain existed in rougher form in front of him, the sheet on the door, the guard's notebook, the medic's record, the check marks that appeared after each count. They did not make him free, but they told him what would happen next. In a sealed space, predictability itself had weight. He looked again at the paper on the iron door. The light swung, yet the letters stayed legible. The verification squares filled one by one, each mark a piece of evidence. The checklist promised no kindness. It promised repetition. That repetition prevented imagination from turning the next minute into a black void, and it forced rumors to hunt for new cracks after every procedure was carried out. Heinrich ran the emergency sequence through his head again, like a code he had to memorize. He told himself it was professional habit, a technician's instinct to learn structure. Yet he could not deny that between iron and sea, structure was beginning to replace the sneer he relied on. Morning brought no true brightness, only the faint flicker of the bulb changing with the watch. The vibration of the hull carried on from night to pre-dawn, like a machine that refused to shut down, pushing heat and damp back into the crowd again and again. Roll call arrived on the timetable. The list was read line by line. Replies echoed from corners and were written down. Verification took longer than the calling. A finger slid along the rows, counting to the last man, and then counting back again before another checkmark appeared. Heinrich heard steadiness in the noise and understood that the notebook would be carried out, delivered upward, and filed into the responsibility chain. Because someone had to answer for the signature above it, the guards did not need emotion to hold the line together. Breakfast was cut into equal pieces. The edges of the tin were sharp, and the men distributing it did not pause even when a finger was sliced. Water still rotated in segments. Cup rims were kept clear of the ladle's wooden handle. Every time a seal was broken or resealed, another mark was added to the record. In the crush, a man pushed his cup deeper. The ladle had to move faster through clustered mouths. Water splashed onto the planks, gathering into a wet patch. A boot slipped. Anger flared instantly in the narrow corridor. The guards blocked the passage until both ends backed away. Only then was the line allowed to resume. Heinrich saw they did not punish the first hand that reached. They punished only the disorder that threatened the sequence and the head count. That restraint kept the argument from swelling into a group brawl, yet it gave Schmidt more material. Each forced step back could be recast as proof of being trained into submission. Schmidt looked for seams between procedures. The short congestion during latrine release became, in his telling, a test. The cold air that entered during ventilation became a warning. Every opening and closing of the door became preparation for sealing them in before the ship went down. Fear, once explained, began to recruit listeners. The more listeners it found, the more it sounded like an instruction. More and more eyes turned toward Heinrich, not only because he understood a few English words, but because he seemed to predict the next line in roll call as if he could read ahead. Someone pointed at the checklist, lips moving quickly, waiting for Heinrich to turn those short lines into German certainty. For the first time, Heinrich felt with clarity that silence was not neutrality. Silence, too, handed over power. He still chose to treat the request as provocation, the urgency as proof of weakness. He kept his distance along the edge of the corridor, pushed the question back with a mocking expression, and stirred his knowing and unknowing together, as if he were deliberately burying the frequency that mattered under radio noise. He dismantled the checklist into a structure in his head, and then refused to hand the structure out. Better that others believed him as ignorant as they were. Then no one could demand that he carry responsibility for the group. The consequences appeared quickly. Schmidt filled the gap Heinrich left behind. He wrapped claims without evidence into a kind of shared certainty. Men who only wanted to understand what the paper said were forced to choose between two stories, and the act of choosing made the group tighter, more brittle, more ready to fracture. Heinrich stood in the shadow of the planks and heard his own derision repeated in other mouths, stripped of his control, changed into something cruder. It no longer belonged to him. The day's medical inspection was stricter. The medic moved down the rows with his board, checking bucket seals, watching whether cups were shared, examining whether waste containers were overflowing. Coughs and broken skin became indicators that had to be reported. Feverish men were moved toward the ventilation gap. The isolation was undignified, but it could cut transmission in a closed space. Supplies were limited. Gauze and disinfectant had to be logged. Waste had to be gathered and removed. Someone treated the isolation as punishment and tried to pull a moved man back into the main group. The line stalled. The corridor jammed. Within minutes, the air grew heavier. The guard did one thing only. He broke the crowd into sections and pushed them back until ventilation could resume. The procedure made every small mistake into a traceable risk. It gave panic no place to throw blame into emptiness. In the afternoon, a safety drill began. The door opened to a set width. The corridor was cleared. The line was divided by head count into segments. Positions were adjusted and readjusted until each segment could pass the narrow opening in the shortest time. The guards' gestures and footwork cut the crowd into manageable blocks. Verification had to be repeated after each movement. The opening and closing of the door could not proceed until the number was confirmed. Schmidt treated the drill as evidence of humiliation. He delayed on purpose. He challenged the rhythm, trying to turn the line into shoving. The guards did not wrestle him for authority. They simply repeated the drill again and again until everyone understood that delay meant one thing: more minutes of oxygen being eaten away in heat. Heinrich watched and chose to remain at the edge. He treated it as performance, a show staged for control. He stood as if on a shoreline, observing a training that did not involve him, preserving the last pocket of identity he thought he still possessed, the ability to refuse participation. Klaus lost control in the latter half of the drill. He stood in the line with fingers gone white, breathing fast, his gaze pinned to a steel beam above the door as if he were calculating its weight. When the line stopped, he began to shake. When it moved, the pressure from behind shoved him into a stagger. Someone, impatient, drove a shoulder into him. Others pressed forward in reflex. The narrow corridor immediately formed a squeeze line that drew toward its center. Heinrich watched and still chose to stand aside, pressing his back to the bulkhead as if he could remove himself from the physics of the crowd. The line did not weaken because he withdrew. It tightened. Klaus's knee struck the planks. Men were forced to step over him. Shoes slipped on damp wood. Panic rolled like a spark along the floor. After the drill, the smell of the hold changed. Sweat and disinfectant mixed. Water streaks crept down bucket walls. Toward evening, the ship's swaying deepened. Chains and pipes in the ceiling began to scrape with a sharper, higher sound. Fine water seeped up through plank seams. Salt and rust were constantly stirred. Above, footsteps grew denser, whistles more frequent. The throbbing of the propellers and the distant reply of escort vessels seeped through steel, warning that the convoy had entered worse sea. The ventilation window was shortened. Door openings and closings became more precise. Each time the latch came down, it was pressed again to confirm. Everything had to be done inside tighter windows. The handwriting of verification marks became more hurried. Schmidt interpreted the tightening as preparation for sealing them in before the ship sank. Each worsening breath became deliberate torment in his mouth. Yet on the checklist, ventilation and verification boxes kept filling. The marks darkened in the damp like rows of nails pinning reality to the deck. The paper's corners curled from moisture and were pressed back down by tape. Fingers smoothed the sheet, and it made a soft, dry, rasping sound in the wet air. Heinrich swallowed saliva that tasted of rust and realized that his silence was steering his comrades toward the least reliable explanations. He still had not stepped over the threshold. Before nightfall, the sea had grown impatient. The convoy's speed dropped. The engines seemed to push harder, as if arguing with an unseen wall of water. The men in the hold spent a long stretch braced against planks and beams, their breathing kneaded into a single warm mass. The checklist's time blocks continued to advance. Roll calls and water rotations and latrine releases came as promised, but shorter and tighter than in daylight, as if the wind outside were cinching the schedule closed. Ventilation narrowed to a slit. Cold air surged in carrying salt and smoke, then vanished beneath sweat and waste the moment the latch sealed the gap again. The medic lingered longer in the corridor, sweeping his flashlight over plank seams and bucket water lines, checking for leaks and overflow, recording coughs and fevered foreheads compressed by crowd pressure. The escort guards pressed the checklist flatter, a hand sliding along the emergency sequence at the bottom as if confirming the order they would have to obey next. Schmidt called the tension preparation for final closure. He had men shift bunks toward the door. He urged a few to occupy the corridor, to be ready to rush out first the moment the door opened. Some were caught by the story and held their cloth bundles with stiff arms, eyes fixed on the crack as if it were the only air left on earth. Heinrich watched without intervening. He treated his silence as his last dignity and his understanding as a weapon that could not be surrendered. He would rather allow fear to be exaggerated than let the checklist become something his comrades depended on. When the storm finally leaned down on the ship, the hold heard the rhythm change first. The hull no longer trembled evenly. It took slanting blows, heavy impacts that lifted and slammed the deck. The bulbs swung inside its cage, the light blotch jerking across the wall. Outside the ventilation slit, wind stretched into a thin, high howl. Above, running footsteps and metal collisions rang out. The noise passed through the steel and landed in every chest. Someone vomited in the dark. The sour stink spread fast, thickening the air. The first water seeped up through deck seams and crawled along the grain. Cold damp spread outward. Waste buckets rocked. Foul water sloshed over the rim, stinging the throat with its smell. A man lifted his foot to avoid water and stepped into deeper slickness. He lost balance. A chain of shoves went through the line. Shoulders and ribs struck each other in the narrow corridor. Fear outran reason. Within seconds, breathing became coarse, uneven, like a ragged surge of surf. Schmidt pushed forward at the instant men turned their heads to search for escape. He tried to turn the line into a wave meant to crash through the corridor. The footsteps outside the door became, in his mouth, a signal to rush. The seeped water became a countdown to sinking. A few men clustered behind him, and the corridor was forced into a narrow wedge. A harder roll of the ship threw the crowd to one side. Bunk frames groaned as if they might split. The squeeze line drew tighter to the center. Shoes skidded on wet planks. Momentum became something that would not stop on command. The inspection window snapped open. Cold air rushed in for a moment, then was swiftly contained by the narrowness of the crack. The guards advanced the emergency procedure in the checklist's order. They first braced and held the corridor. Then they cut the crowd into countable segments, the verification notebook always turning beneath the lamp, the pen scratching across paper with a dry, stubborn sound. The medic forced his way inside with his kit, his flashlight aimed at wiring and the light fixture near the seep point to confirm the risk of shorting, then swung down to push men away from the lowest, wettest strip. Door openings and closings were compressed into strict windows. Any pause that ran long would make the air worse. Any long pause would break the work chain outside the hold. At the bottom of the checklist, the emergency sequence stood out with brutal clarity under the light. Heinrich's memory reproduced it perfectly. He knew that in a crisis the most dangerous thing was not water. It was turning men into a single unstructured force. If the corridor clogged and the ventilation slit was pressed shut by the storm, the line would collapse within the span of a few breaths. His tongue was still lashed by pride, until Klaus lost his footing in the crush. Klaus slipped on the slick deck, his knee cracking down on the planks. His body folded forward. A boot landed on his shoulder. His breath was squeezed out in an instant. Heinrich saw the blue-tinged face pressed against wet wood, and heard the scrape of soles around him like dense bursts of code, wrong rhythm, wrong timing, a pattern that could grind a man into injury that would not undo itself. Schmidt reached for another young prisoner's shoulder and yanked forward. The men behind were forced to follow. The squeeze line accelerated again. The corridor nearly filled solid. Heinrich finally left the bulkhead and pushed into the corridor's gaps. He grabbed Klaus by the upper arm and dragged him out of the squeeze line, lifting his head clear of trampling feet. Several bodies' weight pressed into Heinrich's arm until it went numb. His fingers locked around soaked cloth. Wood splinters bit into his palm. His throat burned with heat and salt and the sharpness of stale breath. He began passing the checklist's key points in short German prompts, again and again, not explaining goodwill and not arguing about loyalties. He made the nearest segment halt. He forced the middle segment to back in order. He returned width to the corridor one measured step at a time. He drove the words for verification and sequence into ears until each movement became countable. What saves lives isn't courage or hatred, but an order that can be verified holding firm inside fear. As that thought set itself down in him, the roar in the hold broke into gaps. The pushing force stopped piling up like surf and was cut into pulses that could be managed. The guards seized the gap and pushed the emergency actions through to completion. Necessary equipment was passed in at the door and distributed by segment, quantities recorded one by one. Men who needed to be nearer the ventilation crack were shifted first. Then the head count was verified again. The pen hesitated and only then laid down its checkmark. The door did not close until verification was complete. The latch hung half-engaged, like a chain that could not be tightened until the numbers were settled. The ship still rolled violently. Water ran in sheets across the planks and surged back. Cold slapped at ankles, teeth clenched against it. Yet the line held under the rhythm of verification. The corridor stayed open. Door openings and closings no longer triggered collision. The medic gathered the men who had been pressed and bruised to a drier section and treated them quickly, recording symptoms to prevent infection from spreading in the damp. Waste buckets were resecured. Spilled foul water was cleared as best it could be. The slick places were marked and watched, not because the storm was gentle, but because another fall could become the first spark of another crush. Schmidt was shoved back toward the corner by the crowd's retreat. His agitation lost its footing and became only a dark look shifting under the swinging light. Someone turned a shoulder to block him. Someone else braced to keep him from pushing forward again. For the first time, the line itself excluded him from the corridor. Heinrich understood that the exclusion was not moral judgment. It was dependence on procedure. Whoever broke sequence became the risk. When the emergency ended, the door was shut again. The latch dropped. The verification notebook was tucked under an arm and carried away. The hold's breathing rose and fell in a single mass, like men hauled back to shore. Wet wood and disinfectant still hung in the air. Heinrich leaned against the bulkhead. His fingers trembled. Mud and splinters clung between them. The sting in his palm was covered by exhaustion that moved like tide water. He lifted his eyes and saw several looks resting on him. Some carried the pull of reliance after terror, others the sharpened hostility of people who had lost control of the story. Those looks pushed him from the place of observer into the line's center. Any attempt to step back into shadow would be noticed. The option was gone. The guard did not look at him with gratitude. The guard's eyes barely moved toward Heinrich at all, except for a brief moment when the line steadied and verification was complete. Then the gaze passed over the muddy streak where Heinrich had dragged Klaus clear. There was no thanks and no forgiveness in it, only the calm that put a man back into procedure. Heinrich was treated as a usable node, not a prisoner granted mercy. In that moment, he understood that no relationship had been formed with the captors. Reality had simply forced him to stand on the same side as rules. Around him, men looked away and wrung water from sleeves. Shoulders turned deliberately aside. In the dark, Schmidt lifted his head and stared at the muddy trace left by Heinrich's drag. A few others followed that stare and marked Heinrich again as an outsider, as if his usefulness to order had made him suspect. After the storm, the hold was left with planks swollen by salt water and a film of sticky grey grime. Water was baled into buckets and carried away again and again. Waste containers were fixed in place. Disinfectant powder was scattered over the slickest patches. The white granules were quickly trampled into wet mud. The bulb no longer swung violently. The light returned to the walls. Breathing slowed from frantic rasp into tired rise and fall. Heinrich pried a splinter from his palm. A bead of blood gathered and stiffened in the cooler air. He wrapped a strip of gauze around it. His fingers still tingled with numbness. The checklist was pressed flat again and taped straight. Verification squares continued to fill. Fresh checkmarks darkened beside last night's water stains, as if the chaos itself had been filed into procedure. Morning roll call hauled everyone out of exhaustion. Numbers and identifiers were checked and rechecked until the last echo faded, and only then was the door permitted to close. The medic walked the bunks and inspected bruised shoulders and ankles. He dabbed iodine onto broken skin. Feverish men were shifted toward ventilation. A simple rope line marked an isolation space. Buckets and cups were separated and labeled. Used gauze was gathered into bags and removed. No one was allowed to treat the storm as an exception. Procedure turned every injury into a record, and every cough into a number that had to be tracked, as if the only way to keep death out of the chain of responsibility was to insist that everything be counted. The next day's rhythm advanced as usual. The ventilation window opened and closed on schedule. Water rotation drew the crowd into segments. In a crush, someone tried to slide a cup ahead of his turn. A shoulder bumped, the line contracted, the air thickened within seconds. Heinrich stood at the side and shoved the man back into place, then delivered the sequence on the door in the shortest German he could manage, forcing the front and rear segments to step back one pace each until a gap returned to the corridor. The guard did not raise his voice. He merely flipped the verification notebook to the relevant box and held the pen still until the line recovered, and only then did the checkmark appear. That single mark behaved like a nail. It pinned agitation where it stood and refused to let it swell into a wave. During one latrine rotation, Schmidt deliberately had several men stand crosswise in the corridor, forcing those behind to detour, trying to manufacture a larger choke point. He leaned his face close, his eyes searching the youngest faces for the telltale quickening of breath. He waited for panic to build again. Heinrich did not confront him directly and did not draw a line of personal rivalry. He simply divided the crowd again into countable segments, sent the nearest segment through first, and then released each following segment by the checklist's nodes, insisting that headcount verification be completed at the end of each segment before the next moved. Congestion was broken into several short pauses. Schmidt's provocation could not keep continuity. The shove impulse died each time verification forced the line to stop and reset. Relationships in the hold hardened under that discipline. Some men turned their bodies away from Heinrich, avoiding his eyes. Others drifted toward him at night and pointed at lines on the checklist they could not read, asking in small gestures for translation in a corner that would not draw attention. Heinrich no longer used derision as a shield. He kept the timetable in his head. He warned the most anxious men to stand nearer the ventilation crack before the line formed. He moved buckets away from the corridor. He rubbed the slickest patches with dry cloth until the wood went rough and resistant. There was no victory in it for him, only the calm of removing risk item by item. His dignity stopped coming from denial and began coming from keeping the next disorder from reaching ignition. The voyage continued west. The smell of salt water gradually mixed with the damp tang of land and smoke. The ship's vibration became more regular. Footsteps above shifted from running to assembling and counting. The door opened to a wider angle under procedure. Prisoners were brought up in segments. Wind struck their faces hard enough to make them squint without thinking. Roll call was repeated in the open. Numbers and identifiers were verified again and again. Medical checks and registration took place at temporary tables. Paper fluttered in the wind. The sound of a stamp coming down was sharp and unmistakable. Along the shore, cranes and warehouse outlines stood in grey daylight. The scrape of wheels and rail echoed from the port. The transport chain had not ended. It had only changed locations. The line moved down the gangway at a measured pace. Shoes struck dock planks with a cleaner, harder sound. Escort personnel handed each segment to new personnel, and the new personnel verified again. Numbers copied and checked across different forms as if the same life needed repeated stamping. Inside a fenced waiting area, Schmidt tried to explain the new environment as another trap. He pointed at distant tracks and trucks, urging fear to find a new exit. Heinrich did not surrender the story again. He passed along the order of the just-finished verification and registration to the men near him, telling them when the next assembly, the next count, the next movement window would come. When the group discovered that each step matched the paperwork, breathing steadied from ragged to even. Quiet plotting was crushed beneath the ordinary clamor of a working port. By evening they were led in segments into rail cars. Before the doors were closed, headcount was verified yet again. Lists and identifiers were secured in folders that traveled with the escorts. When the wheels began to move, the rhythm of the track passed up through wooden floors and metal frames, replacing the sea's roar with a more regular hammering. Heinrich watched the dock recede through a narrow window slit, and thought of the paper still taped to the iron door below deck, a cold coordinate that had told him where to put his body in the worst night, how many segments to split a crowd into, how short to cut fear's momentum into pauses. The rules had not pardoned anyone. They had simply delivered them alive to the handoff point. At the last count before boarding, Heinrich turned his head from the end of the line and looked back once. The checklist still sat where it had been, corners held down with fresh tape. The letters had darkened in the damp, but had not peeled away. A guard smoothed the sheet and pressed his thumb against the emergency line at the bottom, then drew a more visible mark beside the verification boxes, as if making the emphasis unmistakable for whoever would stand here next. Only then did the lock close again. Heinrich pinched the gauze wrapped around his palm, letting the sting remind him the storm had been real. He looked away and followed the line forward. For the first time, his steps carried weight without needing derision to supply it. They were carried by the certainty that sequence could give, as the rail tracks stretching inland waited beneath the wheels.